Hello, welcome once again to Hansraj e-Samvaad. My name is Piyush Chaudhary, Assistant Professor at the Department of English at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. I welcome you all to another lecture on the GE readings on Indian diversity and literary movement. This time it's Ayappa Panikker's poem Passage to America. If I begin with the poem, some of the major themes of the poem Passage to America are firstly, the loss of humanity, you can say, in the face of global warfare. This is the first most important theme. The second important theme is the idea of materialism of the West versus the spirituality of the East. This is the second larger theme. Thirdly, it is cultural politics and cultural differences and cultural conflict. This is the third important theme, as I can see. The fourth is the critique of power and war, the critique of war. So the poem also offers a critique of war and violence. In short, in short, the poem is about the poet's experience in the United States of America. The poem was published in 1972 and it shows Panikker's experience of living in USA. Actually, originally the poet wrote not one poem but a sequence of poems, and this poem that is there in your syllabus is taken from that sequence, right? You will also notice that the poem is very modern in rhyme and in subject matter. This is because the poem does not follow the conventions of a typical poem. There is a certain amount of modernity, of what you can say freshness. There is a freshness and newness and a certain amount of experimentalism in this particular poem. That is why I said it's a modern poem, because there's a new way of writing that the poet employs. It is a new way of writing because it is written in free verse. It is a new way of writing because you will notice, if you look at the poem closely, punctuation marks are rarely given in this entire poem. There are no punctuation marks. So this is a very novel method of writing. There are no commas used, no full stops used, no punctuation marks are used, and students can, and they can observe that most of the other poems that are there in readings on Indian diversity, you will notice that they are punctuated with commas, dash, or full stops as and wherever required. But this poem does not use it. Even the proper nouns, such as the names of the countries, for example, America, New England, Christmas, so on and so forth, they should have been used with a capital letter at the beginning, but it is not used here. So therefore, this is a new method, a novel method, which reinvents and which does not employ traditional methods of poetry. So free verse is also used in this poem. No punctuation marks are there. And also you will notice that the tone of the entire poem is almost conversational. It's very fast. It's as if the poet is having a conversation with someone. And so all these elements which I just now described are elements of modern poetry. They are unconventional. It is different from the traditional poetry that we read, usually. And this is the reason why this poem can be concluded as a very modern poem, because of the subject matter that is being used here, because of the experimental techniques that Panikker uses, right? So basically, the poem was translated into English. Originally, it was written in Malayalam, and he was also. I mean, of course, when he was living in USA, he was speaking in his main language was English, and he was pursuing his PhD from a university in USA, and English was his second language. You can say so in a foreign country, but and Panikkar has himself stated that in several places, right? So therefore, the poem becomes important for us to read because the topic that we are currently doing is Indian writing in English. We need to see how writers and poets, how they negotiate with the English language, which is obviously their second language. It is a second language because for an Indian, for an Indian like me, for any Bharatiya like you, English is always, our second language. It is not our mother tongue at all, but it is an important language because it allows us to make sense of in a foreign world. This is exactly what the poet Panikkar is doing while he is translating the poem originally written in Malayalam into English in a foreign land in USA, which is giving him a sense of identity, right? So with this, let us now go to the first line of the poem, and I'll be reading the entire poem stanza by stanza. Look at these lines. It's as if I suddenly meet you on the way when I go for my usual walk in the evening. The earth that begins at your feet seems to end at mine. The air you breathe out enters into my lungs, and the light that escapes from your eyes focuses on mine. So, therefore, in these lines, who is the poet referred to in the first line? He says that it's as if I suddenly meet you. Here, you is USA, the America. Here, the poet is showing his deep connection with America. He's talking to America and he's saying that the earth that begins at your feet, it ends at mine. And the air that you breathe out is the air that I breathe in. And the light of America is the light that focuses on me. So basically, he's he's showing his deep connection with America because he's living in America and he's pursuing his PhD over there, right? And he says right on the next line, uh, he says, America, I see your map like the palm of a hand stretched out on my lap. Mississippi traces your lifeline to the south while the Great Lakes draw circles, right? So here it is once again clear that he's referring to America. He's describing the geography of USA, the Mississippi rivers and the several states of USA, right? Then he goes on to say, but America, where has vanished your heartline? And some test explosion sucked it underground. I remember River Falgun that goes dry in summer, defying our praise, where once the Buddha got enlightenment and learned to take the earth for a begging bowl. But here the fission and the fusion your scientist envision offer your palmists nothing but confusion. Very interesting lines. In these lines, the tone is ironic because he is referring to the dangerous nuclear tests which were done in USA during the Cold War era of 1960s. These were dangerous technological advancements and it was being passed off as a necessity. It was said that it's important to make nuclear bombs. However, everyone knows the problems that nuclear bombs can create and the series of disturbances it can create. We very well know the idea of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Look at, you can Google it to know about it. We were so close to a nuclear fallout, right? So, he's referring to these tests. So, it, as I mentioned, it's also an anti-war poem, right? The references to Buddha in these lines are important because the poet is comparing and contrasting what you can say the Indian culture, Bharatiya ethos, which is represented by Buddha, and he juxtaposes it with the nuclear fission reactions of America and the West in Europe and in Russia of the 1960s Cold War era. So this is being juxtaposed. The tone is evidently ironic, sarcastic, and the scientists are offering confusion. Scientists are meant to offer clarity, but they are offering confusion. This is what Panikker is saying. So, loss of humanity in the face of global warfare. This is an important theme, right? And the materialism of the West versus the spirituality of the East, as I mentioned earlier on, right? The poem is also offering a critique of war and poetry. I also mentioned this. These are some of the major important themes. But the most important of them all is the idea of the materialism of the West versus the spirituality of the East, right? The materialism of the West is symbolized by the scientists of the West. However, the spirituality of the East is represented by whom? By Buddha, by the idea of Buddha as a torch bearer of enlightenment, of civilization, as a torch bearer of enlightenment in Asia and in the East. So basically, what can you notice? I'm sure the readers will be able to see that the poet is criticizing the capitalism of USA, the relentless pursuit of money in USA. So these are some of the important themes, you know. Uh, but let's go forward. He says, someone said there was never such a lie in this ancient newborn land where we grow corn and PL 480 and make color TV sets in plenty till our chests are nearly empty and brains sprout tons of TNT. So, in these lines, basically, the poet was talking about the contemporary Indian problem of food security during the 1970s. When he was writing this poem during the late 1960s or early 1970s, PL 480, that is Public Law 480, it was in motion where the Indians relied on food after independence from the USA. And the USA arm twisted us in whichever way they could, and this was the time when our first prime minister died, and the other prime minister Lal Bahadur Shastri, he took over after Pandit Nehruji's death. So this was a time of food scarcity in India, and the help was extended by USA in the form of PL 480, but they bullied India for giving us food. So those were different time, but then with the onset of the Green Revolution, today we are a self-sufficient country, and it's a strong country, and we are going towards Viksit Bharat, as we all know, right? So, but those that was also a time almost 80, 70, 80 years ago from today, when we were bullied by other nations. Today we are not. But that is a different thing. So, therefore, how things have changed in the last 60 years. That's the point that I'm trying to say. And Panikker was writing, back then, so that's why it's different from the context of the contemporary scenario today. Now, lastly, let me also talk about the TNT that he mentions. Brain spouting tons of TNT. You know, as we all know, during the 1960s and 70s, that was an age of huge proliferation of nuclear weapons. The USA and Russia was, they were fighting against each other. They were in a race for, who can create more weapons of mass destruction. So this is exactly what he is referring to. So here the poem ends, but also ends along with the poem. You can say so, is the illusion of USA being a free land, of being a happy land, being a safe land for the poet Ayappa Panicker. So another important element is that the poet K Ayappa Panicker is disillusioned by USA, because the USA is relentlessly pursuing on nuclear weapons and weapons of global mass destruction. So the poet is also offering a critique of war in a foreign land where he has gone to complete his PhD, and there he is disillusioned. So, in short, Ayappa Panicker in this poem talks about Indian ethos, Indian sensibility, and he is juxtaposing the Indian sensibility with US materialism. So, therefore, the poem talks about politics, it talks about war, futility of life. He's offering a critique of war, violence, you know. So there is a tone of irony also that he is employing. So therefore, all in all, it is an experimental poetry which brings in new methods of lyricism, which brings in free verse, which brings in experimental poetry, modern poetry. And I told you in the beginning of this lecture, with the sentences not beginning with capital letters, proper nouns not being used with the capital letters, and there is very little punctuation, almost no punctuation marks. There are no punctuation marks. So so this is a very subjective way of writing. So the negation of such conventions, he is negating such conventions. It reflects a sense of revolt and rebellion on the part of the writer. The writer is not using capital letters. It creates a distancing. It creates a sense of distance. So this takes the attention of the reader away, from the fact of translation. This poem is originally translated, but we don't really think about it. So that's how readers write, that's how poets write, and that's how it creates an effect in the minds of the readers like you and me. So with this, I come to the end of this lecture. I hope the readers were able to understand and appreciate the the unique ways in which Ayappa Panicker wrote, and how he uses experimental poetry. And so these are some of the major techniques that the poet he uses, and the various themes that he has employed. I hope the readers were able to understand that, and I hope the students will be able to prepare for their incoming exams using these points. I thank you all once again for joining me at Hansraj e-Samvaad. I will see you very soon with a few more lectures which are on the way for readings on Indian diversity and literary movements. I'll join you once again, and I look forward to meeting you again. Thank you, goodbye, and Jai Hind.